Hello, my name is Shantae, and I am going to be talking about Chapter 12, titled Personality Change in Extreme Situations. So the book describes different types of situations, which include disasters brought by nature or by human. An example of natural disasters are earthquakes, floods, and tornadoes. Human-made disasters are, for example, the Nazi Holocaust or hostage situations under international terrorism. That also includes total institutions. What total institutions is institutions in which all aspects of someone's daily life is controlled by one person. How people think, feel, and act during these severe and extreme circumstances. This chapter focused on the concentration camp situation, which focused its attention on inmates' personalities. Bruno Bettelheim studied concentration camps, and he himself was incarcerated by Nazis in Germany in 1938 to 1939. He wrote a book called Individual and Mass Behavior in Extreme Situations, which was based on his own experience in a Nazi concentration camp. He talks about two different things, which are main purpose was to change prisoners into useful subjects of the Nazi state by exposing them to extreme situations. And two, different stages or processes of prisoner personality changes were observed. Bettelheim said that Nazi Gestapo's goal was to break individuals and change them so that resistance could not arise within the group. They would spread terror among the population by using the prisoners as hostages and by demonstrating what happens to people who oppose the Nazi rulers. Gestapo members were so trained to lose their emotions and attitudes and learn effective ways of breaking civilian resistance, minimum food, hygienic and medical requirements to keep prisoners alive and able to do hard labor. They wanted to attain a goal, which was prisoners by exposing prisoners to extreme situations that include torture, malnutrition, exposure to heat, rain, and freezing temperatures. Also including complete isolation from the outside world, hard labor, humiliation, and degradation of sense of human worth. Stages of personality change in extreme situations. Bettelheim talks about 4 different stages, which are initial shock, and that is being deprived of one's civil rights, for example. Second stage was emotional detachment, which was caused by torture, human degradation during transportation to camp, and first experiences in the camp. Number 3 was adaptation to the camp situation, which was regression to infantile behavior. And number 4 was acceptance, which was the final adjustment to camp, accepting Nazi values as your own. Many prisoners' reactions were based on socioeconomic background. Some middle class committed suicide while in prison and during the transportation process. During transportation, prisoners were punished and tortured to break their resistance. They were whipped, slapped, kicked, forced to hit one another, some killed from time to time. Physical torture was done to defile the prisoners' cherished values and dignity. For example, prisoners were forced to curse their God, accuse wives of adultery and prostitution, and accuse themselves of vile actions. Bettelheim gives an example of experienced terror and humiliation. Bettelheim says that he was able to endure the transportation and all that happened because he became convinced that these horrible things did not happen to him as a subject, but only to him as an object. Says that he realized that he was not the only one who used this detachment method. Many of the other prisoners did also. They'd say, "This cannot be true. Such things like this just don't happen." So they had to convince themselves that this really happened and that it was not just a nightmare. They talk about different types of prisoners. So new prisoners are those who had spent less than a year and were still preoccupied with the hope of returning to the outside world. Old prisoners were those who spent at least 3 years in camp. Their primary concern became how to survive another day within the camp. And then the here and now, which realizing everything was real and were afraid of returning to the outside world. So the here and now had adapted themselves to camp life, and this process coexists with basic change. So many of the prisoners develop a childlike dependency on the immediate environment. Bettelheim describes what he meant by infantile behavior. It says that prisoners lived only in the present. They lost the feeling for the sequence of time, became unable to plan for the future or give up immediate pleasure to gain greater ones in the future. Friendships developed as quickly as they broke up, and like adolescents, they would fight and make up, and they'd become boastful when talking about their former lives and felt no setbacks. They forced prisoners into having childhood attitudes and behaviors more or less willingly. They mentioned how the weaklings usually died first within the first weeks. Old prisoners sometimes were the ones to get rid of them, becoming more a feature of Gestapo's ideology. They also talk about personality changes in concentration camps based on 4 stages. Like mentioned earlier, 1 was the initial shock, so feeling of disbelief, worthlessness, resentment. Stage 2, their period of denial, for example, apathy and depression, which was the isolation of effect. Stage 3, regression into infantile behavior and dependency. And stage 4, identification with the perpetrator. But not all 4 stages of experience. Not all prisoners experience the 4 stages the same way. Some may give up struggle to live early stage. Musselman refers to becoming numb to the point of becoming a robot, or walking like a corpse. Some would avoid direct confrontation and fantasizing Next, the chapter talks about coping strategies in concentration camps. And it doesn't only mean coping behavior. It also involves external changes in one's relationship to the environment, internal changes in personality, short and long-term consequences, both positive and negative effects on personality. Banner, Rockies, and Lazarus define coping strategies by, they say, coping represents the attempt to manage stress by resolving the disturbed person-environment relationship directly or diminishing the emotional distress resulting from it. Mentioned multidimensional functions, which lessen the immediate impact of stress, shape ongoing stress experience, and chart the future events and actions. Dimsdale says that truly functional, which are positive, coping behaviors not only lessen the immediate impact of stress, but also allows a person to maintain some sense of self-worth. Dimsdale mentions 10 different coping strategies used by concentration camp survivors. You can find that on page 366. One is a differential focus on the good. The selective attention helps prevent emotional breakdown under extreme stress. Number 2, survival for some purpose. So one has a purpose, a strong reason or meaning for survival in order to help. I guess one of the reasons could be they want to help their relatives, or to tell the world what happened, or to even seek revenge. So the psychiatrist Viktor Frankl and writer Elie Wiesel, who also survived the Nazi camp, emphasize an extremely powerful coping strategy of seeking meaning in suffering or fulfilling a survivor mission. Number 3 is psychological removal, which is using strategies on intellectualization belief in immortality, time distortion, sense of humor, profound apathy, and they use these strategies to attempt to lessen their subjective emotional suffering by transferring it into an object of scientific study. Frankl describes it as a form of daydreaming. He says, "Both I and my troubles became the object of an interesting psychoscientific study undertaken by myself. Bettelheim's and his fellow inmates consider or used belief in immortality, or I guess you can call it religious beliefs, is another way of removing oneself from the hostile world to have hope and meaning. So, like saying a prayer that would give them strength. And time distortion, or selective focus on time, has been found to be used to detach oneself from the impact of stress. People would focus on remembering all the good times, or live in an imagined future of freedom and comfort, or focus only on the present, one's own survival from one moment to another. Humor was known as a positive coping strategy, a potent agent for psychological removal from stress situations. The effectiveness of various psychological withdrawal strategies depends on the nature and extent of denial, apathy, and emotion isolation or numbness. Number 4, mastery, which was an effort to manipulate or resist the stress system by engaging in physical and mental activities. So by keeping their mind occupied. Number 5, group affiliation is a positive function for reducing the impact of stress and enhancing the chance of survival. So providing information, advice, and protection. Dimsdale points out that the size of a group could be just 2 people, which was very common, and it is very effective in mediating between the person and stress. And often, if an inmate did not find a group, their chances of survival were very limited. Lecherhan says that a pair was the basic unit of survival in the concentration camp, which provided protection, information, help in organizing, opportunities for necessary exchange and sharing, and for the relief of guilt. Frankel, being placed with prisoners who spoke says that being placed with prisoners who spoke a different language was more or less a death sentence. Tinger says that survivors credit their psychological and physical survival to friends. Number 6 was will to live, which was one of the most important aspects of coping. To some, this was only coping, mediating between the individual and surrender to stress. Number 7, the mobilization of hope. 2 forms of hope were observed, which was an active hope, a belief that camp would not last, a conviction that this cannot go on forever, and 2, more passive, does conveying the attitude that where there is life, there is hope. Number 8 was regressive behavior, regression into childlike behavior and dependency in an effort to receive help from other inmates or from camp guards. Chodov talks about how such regression is that many prisoners, like children, became quite dependent on their savage masters. Attitudes towards the SS were marked by ambivalence, then by conscious over-hostility. Number 9 was anti-coping, which was surrender to stress, completely surrender and realize that it is right and the self is wrong. This strategy removes the dissonance of a situation. Dimsdale says that this was not a common strategy among survivors of German concentration camps. Number 10, null coping. A person does not do anything and relies on fate or others, such as behavior did not lessen stress but alters the perception of it. Examples of some of these coping methods are mastery, which is the will to live, hope or faith, sequence, which is apathy, regression, childlike dependency, or identifying with the aggressor. Alternately, with identification is denial, meaning apathy, regression, humor. Denial and isolation is a psychological removal or withdrawal, which considers the most universal forms of coping strategies in extreme situations. Psychological withdrawal is when you build a wall between the situation and yourself, and it becomes hard to make a person deal with reality again, with a person who's done that. Focus on survival can be dangerous, if reason for survival is destroyed, and compromising, which can be overwhelmed with guilt. Um, 5 ideal types of general levels are mastery, denial, psychological removal, regression, and dependency and identification. An example is regression and childlike dependency are linked with later stages of concentration camp experiences, which are adaptation or acceptance. Bloom and Halsom's recent study points out mortality rates were usually low among 500 prisoners who were incarcerated in the Japanese camp in the Philippines, Camp Holmes, during World War II. Conditions were harsh, but survival rate is better than expected compared to a group with normal conditions. And this can be based on psychosocial environment. So number 1 is physical environment, which is like healthy climate, bed-free person, managed camp space for exercising or privacy. Number 2, personal backgrounds, self-selected and highly educated group of persons like doctors, teachers, business persons, engineers, who were prepared to deal with stressful conditions in a foreign land. Number 3, socio-cultural environment, a strong group with solidarity and social support function as the most important survival factor. An example of that, they were able to run their own camp as long as no rules were broken. High levels of both hope and discomfort that motivate people to accomplish difficult goals. Next section I talked about was post-traumatic stress disorder, previously called concentration camp syndrome. Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist, he shared 3 experiences that may damage character of survivor. 1 is moral deformity, which is a sudden release of mental pressure when a survivor desires for revenge by similar experience that surrounded them in camp. Number 2 is bitterness, and that's feeling experienced against in your hometown upon return. So their suffering was neither recognized or understood by their hometowns. Number 3, disillusionment, which is survivors' perception of their fate as perpetual sufferer, even after liberation and unclear normal life conditions. The example was, even if they thought for years they had reached the absolute limit of all possible suffering, now they found that suffering has no limit and realized they could still suffer more and more intensely. PTSD before it was called concentration camp syndrome. And some of the commonly identified symptoms are nightmares, insomnia, anxiety, chronic depression, social isolation, survival guilt, substance abuse, emotional numbness, mistrust, moodiness, immobility, hostility, tormenting memories, flashbacks, and dependency. Rudolph H. Moose says that unusual stresses on human adaptation, including those of concentration camp survivors, natural disasters, atomic disasters, rape victims, and human adjustment to a foreign country. One survival situation is largely dependent upon the strength of one's subjective sense of mastery, which is again their hope, their will to live, and their faith. A fatal sense of submission is, again, hopelessness, helplessness, and complete apathy to the traumatic stress. The study of personality in extreme situation has to deal with increasing extreme situations of institutionalized oppression, rationalized terrorism, and normal anatomy. And that is what my chapter was about.